The story of Francia begins with the story of Aquitaine, once a vassal dukedom under the Capet kings of France. As strange as that sounds, it must be remembered that Christendom was much different than it is now nearly 300 years ago. It was a time of crusade like today, but against the Muslim in Iberia and the Holy Land, not against the Mongol in Eastern Europe. Let us begin by telling again what has already passed for the de Poitou dynasty and Aquitaine. In the first chapter, Duke Guillaume VIII of Aquitaine got control of his vassals and significantly strengthened his dynasty's position, establishing a faction for independence from France and then declaring war on his liege in April of 1069. Though a near thing, skillful deployment of forces and good fortune brought victory in June 1072. After some difficulty and great worry, he was able to get a son, John, in 1074, and thus prevent the division of his lands among his 3 daughters. Immediately after, he saw to the death of his wife so as to prevent future heirs from complicating the succession and fracturing Aquitaine. An abortive war to seize the county of Foix followed in 1076, ending when the rebellious Duke of Toulouse was reabsorbed back into the Kingdom of France. 1077 was a year for marriages and betrothals. First, the King of Navarre tried to foist a bastard off on Duke Guillaume's daughter, an attempt that prompted the good Duke to arrange a proper betrothal for his own son to the youngest daughter of the Duke of Toulouse. Later that same year, he gave his daughter in marriage to the Byzantine Emperor, sealing an alliance that he hoped would secure Aquitaine from adversaries, but instead drew the dukedom into a war against the Seljuk Turks. Oh, very well. Within months, however, the emperor died in battle, and it was all for naught. Oh no! Looking to the future, Guillaume sent his chancellor to Maine to begin working on fabricating a claim to that rich county. This one seems pleasant enough. The duke considered marriage again, but decided against it, preferring the freedom of unfettered latter days. Don't lose that prestige. Though the stresses of his office weighed heavily upon his heart, looking to be English, the decade looked like it would close out well, until a grave malady struck him down at Yuletide in 1079. Well, that's an interesting thing to happen right before the end of the first session. January 1080 finds the independent Duchy of Aquitaine in the hands of a regent, with an infirm and aged duke likely to die and pass along the reins to an unready boy. How long can Guillaume hold out? And will the King of France raise his host to crush Aquitaine when he dies? Let's see what comes to pass. Shortly after falling ill, the Duke Guillaume VIII perished in the spring of 1180, leaving the Duchy of Aquitaine at the tender mercies of a regent who hated young John I. John quickly worked to improve relations with his vassals, dispensing gold and titles to those most aggrieved at the boy duke. Forced to seek the tutelage of a drunkard, John's future was far from certain, and by December of 1180, 2 ambitious men propped up a cousin of John as the Duchess of Aquitaine. This was put down quickly through the use of hired swords and vassal levies in the spring of 1181, and 2 rich ransoms were extracted from the rebel counts. In the wake of this succession war, the pretender sued successfully for house arrest, and a period of calm prevailed. The young duke showed stiffness of spine in January 1183 on the occasion of a drunken count murdering a servant at a feast, earning John a reputation as a harsh but just ruler. An outbreak of general peasant lawlessness in November 1183 took a more serious cast when Count Guillaume of Angoulême and the aforementioned murderer count rebelled in favor of a pretender from outside the realm. This was again put down quickly through the expeditious use of hired men in May of 1084. Duke John was forced to make a hard decision as Clemencia de Poitou attempted to escape house arrest in 1085, only to be thrown into the pit for her troubles. This act, as well as the putting down of 2 rebellions and an outbreak of lawlessness, obtained for the realm 5 years of peace, and aside from the occasional incident of overdrunkenness at a feast, the land healed. John's minority finished out in the summer of 1090, with his chancellor Count Robert of Auvergne successfully penning legal claim to the county of Maine after more than 10 years of trying, and sufficient golden respect from Mother Church attained to declare himself King of Aquitaine. Now a man, Duke John I wasted no time setting out to win fame and glory, petitioning Pope Anastasius IV to join the First Crusade at Yuletide 1090. Before setting out for the Holy Land, John wed Adela de Toulouse in March of 1091, pocketing a tidy sum and securing an alliance with Toulouse. After 3 months at sea, John and his small host of 1,700 men landed in Tripoli and set siege to Boutron, assaulting it and taking it on the 31st of July, 1091. Hearing that a Christian host, outnumbered, was giving battle in Beirut, Aquitaine rushed south to help, saving the day but nearly being crushed by a mighty host of Saracens marching north from Sur. It was a close thing, with the men rowing for their lives, but they were able to escape to the ships. Before Duke John was gone a year, Count Adalbert of Perigord, a perennial rebel in Aquitaine, declared the pretender Pierre de Savoy as the true ruler of Aquitaine and raised his levies. John curtailed his crusading and returned to Aquitaine, crushing this rebellion in May of 1092. After consolidating his hold on the Duchy of Aquitaine, John declared himself king and rightful lord over Aquitaine and Toulouse in April 1093. This was met with no opposition, and John instituted increased restrictions on his vassals in December that same year. A period of peace followed, with no events of note other than the filling of John's coffers. In 1094, feeling secure at last, John married his sisters, Ines, Elaine, and Philippa off to various lords, and the period of tranquility continued uninterrupted. In 1096, John established himself as a mild ruler. Bernat, Chancellor of Aquitaine, requested permission to fight a duel, which was granted, and John interceded with the Pope on behalf of Prince Bishop Pierre Raymond of Agen, effecting the lifting of his excommunication. By autumn of 1096, John, feeling secure in his kingship, saw opportunity to declare war with King Philippe of France over the county of Toulouse, a rich land bordering Aquitaine and rightfully belonging to it. After a series of hot assaults on strongholds in Toulouse, Foix, and Carcassonne, the King of France acceded to John's demands in December 1097. Not one to hang back, John declared war on the Count of Maine a few months later and wrested control of that rich county from Richard de Normandy in April 1099. John ended the decade considering the claim of his vassal, the newly created Duke of Gascogne, over the county of Navarre to the south, and looking into the children of King Garcia of Navarra and King Sancho III of Castile. Somewhat tardily, Adela de Toulouse began to show with child in January 1100, and there is hope that the new kingdom of Aquitaine shall soon have a boy heir. Can John I, King of Aquitaine, continue to rule justly and set his dynasty on a path to greatness? John's hopes for a son were dashed when a healthy daughter, Elaine, was born in August 1100. In May 1101, John discovered that Count Hamelin of Limousin had started a faction for pursuing lower crown authority in Aquitaine, and measures were taken to win him over. Surprisingly, Duke Carlos, who owed so much to King John, had joined this movement, but quickly demurred once Hamelin abdicated from the plot. That betrayal notwithstanding, John decided to go to war with the King of Navarre over Duke Carlos's claim on the county of Navarra, a war that was successfully concluded in July 1102. Since John's vassal, Count Archambault of Bourbon, held claim on the county of Bourges, war was declared on the Duke of Anjou, busy fighting his own war of independence against the King of France. Just as Aquitaine mustered its host, the happy news of a second child in the belly of the Queen reached John's ears. During the fighting, a daughter, Elessa, was born in July 1103, and the war was ended soon after Count Archambault taking the county of Bourges as his own. Castile, being racked by division and rebellion to the south, seemed a natural path for expansion, and in April 1104 John decided to once again muster the host of Aquitaine, this time to press Duke Carlos of Gascogne's claim on the county of Vizcaya. Count Anico of Vizcaya's armies elsewhere, and his strongholds lightly defended, The county came into Duke Carlos's hands in September that same year. It was at this time that the growing power of the de Bern dynasty came to light, with Duke Carlos holding Bern, Navarra, and Vizcaya, and his heir Count Centol holding Marsan. In 1105, at the age of 30, John finally became a credible diplomat and began to turn his efforts toward better stewardship of the realm. As the weather grew warmer in the spring of 1107, John decided to press Duke Carlos's claim on the county of Najera, the risk of concentrating too much power in the hands of the de Berns notwithstanding. This war was over in time for John's vassals to oversee the harvests in October. The truce with King Philippe of France over in December 1107, John went to war for the Duchy of Gevaudan in eastern Aquitaine. In what has become a bit of a common theme, news reached him that the Queen was with child as he marched to the front, and a son, John, was born in February 1109. Philippe, engaged in northern France in a vain attempt to bring his rebellious vassals to heel, could not resist, and John burned and killed in Toulouse without let. In the midst of all of this, John, longing for meat and drink and the comfort of a tavern, decides to go into the taverning business in Melguil. As King John I laid siege to the King of France's holdings in eastern Aquitaine, his chancellor's efforts in Brittany bore fruit, a legal claim to the county of Nantes. John, seeing his vassals forming factions against him while at war, sent warrant of arrest to Duke Alberic, who defied King John and raised his levies. While running these wars from his tavern in Melguil, John pocketed a tidy sum and eased the discomfort of a long campaign. In November 1111, Duke Alberic was imprisoned, and John continued to lay siege to King Philippe's castles, concluding that war and obtaining the title Duchy of Gevaudan and the County of Gevaudan in February 1112. A daughter, Euphrosynia, was born almost immediately afterwards in March, the news coming to King John as he marched home in triumph. Not one to rest on a legal claim, King John gave his hosts scant rest, then raised them again in May 1112 to pry the county of Nantes from the Duke of Brittany. During this war, Duke Carlos of Gascogne created himself Duke of Navarra, giving rise to suspicion in King John that soon he would vie for kingship of Aquitaine. John's chancellor, a skilled intriguer, wrote legal claim to the county of Nevers in Burgundy in February 1114, and a groan rose from the host of Aquitaine, wearying of constant battle. But it was not to be. After wresting the county of Nantes from Brittany in July 1114, John sent his vassals home and did not pursue his claims in Nevers. In March 1115, another boy, Guilhem, was born to King John, and 3 peaceful years followed. In 1118, King John married his eldest daughter Elaine to Prince Thorvald of Denmark, hoping to see her onto the throne of that kingdom, but Thorvald perished suspiciously less than a week later. Not to be deterred, King John arranged a similar marriage to a prince of Norway, and the union between the kingdoms of Norway and Aquitaine was consummated in July 1118. 18 months later, on receiving reports of rebellion in Norway, King John knew that it was time. On Christmas Day 1119, he sent declaration of war to the King of Norway, supporting the claim of his son-in-law to the throne of that land, and raising his vassals to war in the north. King John, now having seen 45 summers and beginning to feel his age, makes landfall in Viken on the 25th of April 1120 and begins marching toward the Norwegian interior, bypassing a rebel army. His intent is to allow the King of Norway and his rebel prince to fight one another while he focuses on reducing Norway's strongholds. Thankfully, while John was away, little of import passed, save that his court chaplain fell into the snares of heresy and had to be put in chains. After a long campaign, King John forced the King Torgir of Norway to recognize Aslak I as King of Norway, and John's son-in-law was crowned on the 8th of February, 1125. As King John made his way back home, word came of John II's passage into manhood, and passage through various members of Aquitaine's manhood. At about the same time, Duke Armand reported that he had successfully crafted legal claim on the county of Rennes, held by Earl Robert of Mortain. Aslak, no hangback, committed Norway to holy war for Karelia, and though Aquitaine's vassals could not bear another campaign in the north, John supported his son-in-law liberally, then raised them to seize the county of Penthièvre from Duke Eosin of Brittany in February 1127. Duke Arnaud, ever a resourceful man, went about his lord's business in Asturias de Santillana, keeping King John ever supplied with causes for war. King Elaine of France, having had enough of Aquitaine's expansion, declared war in January 1129, hoping to recover the county of Bourges. Aslak, who owed so much to King John, could not be bothered to raise his levies and aid his father-in-law. The decade ended with John no longer a young man, but confidently at war with France and with claims on 4 counties. Can John complete the work his chancellor has made possible and establish dominance in France before death takes him? January 1130 finds the 55-year-old King John the Great of Aquitaine at war with France over Bourges, and having claims on the counties of Anjou, Nevers, Rennes, and Asturias de Santillana that will not survive his death. By autumn, having defended stoutly against the King of France, but seeing a large enemy host bearing down to undo his work, John offers the White Peace to King Elaine, which offer is accepted on the 10th of November 1130. During Yuletide 1130, John chooses to deal harshly with the vexatious chancellor of Count Aymeric of Foix, and his men visit him privily to effect his death. Hard of heart against grasping men as he is, John still has a soft spot for his more talented kinsman, and he takes young Constancia de Poitou under his tutelage in the spring of 1131, hoping perhaps that she might one day be a good wife for his heir, John II. Summer 1131 finds King John not so amorous toward his queen, and rather than spend time with her, he chooses the company of learned men. His efforts give him comfort, and a wider understanding of the cosmos in which he finds himself adrift. Feeling thus emboldened, John makes war on King Elaine of France for Nevers, hoping to seize it before death takes him. The levies of Aquitaine raise up and begin marching to the seat of war in Nevers in September 1131. By November, John is at the head of nearly 9,000 men, laying siege to Angers in Nevers, while King Elaine of France, with 5,600 men, breaks down Bourges. John responds hotly to the news, declaring assaults on Angers, Saumur, and Cholet, but these intakings are matched apace by King Elaine, who storms Deaul in January 1132. John remains undistracted, choosing to continue his work of taking French strong places without giving battle, figuring on contending with the French host later on once he has subdued many of his holdings in the contested region. However, by March 1132, seeing that France has left behind lightly defended garrisons in Bourges, he cleaves off some portion of his force to return them forcibly to Aquitanian control. This has the desired effect, and in short time, not only is Bourges and Deaul restored, the host of Aquitaine's ally, Genoa, comes under John's banner, and he controls some 12,000 men-at-arms. So armed, John rakes France for gold over the next 2 years, launching his avarice-fueled men into Orléans in July 1132, Sens in October 1132, Vendôme in November 1132, Auxerre in December 1132, and Nevers in February 1133. By August 1133, King Elaine of France sends his men back into France to try and undo John's work, but his kingdom is unhinged from within. Cloyes, Nevers, La Charité, and Courtenay fall in the space of 2 months, and John sends his men to retake his fortresses in Bourbon. As Christmas season approaches in 1133, King John rides northeast to Nevers toward the French host, deciding to put the King of France into submission and bloody constraint at last. The battle rages without let on Christmas Day and New Year's too, and the French host withdraws bloodied from the field hard by La Charité on the 2nd of January 1134. John pursues into Charolais as a hard rain begins to fall, and the demoralized French host is defeated again on the 22nd of January, Julien Capet falling prisoner. France flees to Macon, now outnumbered 3-1 and badly frightened with a fresh Aquitanian host on their heels. King Alain of France sues for peace, but John refuses, desiring to wring every bit of gold he can from the once overlord of the de Poitou dynasty and establish once and for all Aquitaine's independence. In February 1334, the host of France is eradicated as a coherent force at Charolles, its survivors escaping as they can in small groups or singly returning to their homes. His kingdom lies prostrate at Aquitaine's feet as Occitan and Genoan men-at-arms sack houses, churches, and warehouses, carrying away a generation's treasure in the short space of a season. However, hard campaigning has taken its toll on King John, and he shivers, racked by a fever in his tent in April 1334. As Aquitaine's hosts beat upon the gates of fortresses in Chartres and Charolais, John's condition worsens, and he passes into the mansions of the Lord on the 10th of May 1334, having proved the independence of his kingdom on France's body. King John the Great of Aquitaine fell ill in his 59th spring, dying as he lived, leading troops in Charolais on the 10th of May 1134. After briefly considering a betrothal to the Queen of Denmark, John II surprised many in his court by sending a proposal to the father of an obscure courtier, Ide Wykersdochter van Vlaanderen, daughter of the Chancellor of Flanders. The proposal on its way, John convened his council, took stock of his vassals, and sent gold and titles to those most aggrieved of the current state of affairs in the realm. Matters settled as well as they could, John II refused the surrender of King Alain of France, preferring to plunder his lands for a while and establish his reputation firmly with his noble cousin that, like his father, he was not to be trifled with. While this war boiled on, Duke Sven of Geleen sent word invoking an obscure treaty that existed between Aquitaine and his duchy, and John, though far from intending to march his levies north hastily, agreed so as to avoid poor reputation. It was not long after the death of King John the Great that John II realized that he was not the administrator his father was, and he divested himself of the Bishop of Aurillac and the County of Nantes in November 1134. By May 1135, only a year into John's rule, it became apparent that all was not well, with vassals forming factions to reduce the prerogative of the young king, or even place Alessa de Poitou on the throne. Queen Ide went to La Marche to get to the heart of the matter, and gold flowed in an attempt to persuade Aquitaine's vassals to let off these plots and schemes. Nothing came of these overtures, and King John II, feeling that matters were nigh to coming to a head in Aquitaine, received in January 1136 a second missive of surrender from King Alain of France. John accepted terms in his favor, ending that war and securing the county of Nevers. John sent liberal gifts to the lords of Aquitaine, thanking them for their forbearance, then disbanded their levies to march home. Suspecting that war was likely to come whether sought or no, John II raised a company of archers to augment the land's already stout retinue, then remembering his promise to Duke Sven, put to sea with them in April 1136. As John stood on the docks ready to depart for Denmark, Queen Ide sent word that she had successfully found a cleavage in the faction to lower crown authority, and was instructed to use legal means to convince them rather than threats of violence. A review of the royal laws of Aquitaine revealed that while there were some laws that could be changed for better relations with John's vassals, they were on the whole sound and left unmolested, and the land remained at peace. By the summer of 1137, Aquitaine's coffers overflowing, John decided upon a legacy as a builder rather than a conqueror, and embarked upon a policy of improvement of domain lands, establishing villages and towns across Aquitaine, even squirting a child into the belly of the queen. Elaine, a handsome and alert daughter, was born on the 5th of January, 1138. In that same month, John received report that while the factions discovered in 1135 had not abated, neither had they grown more broad. John considered revoking the county of Limousin from Count Hamelin, a known plotter and rebel, but decided against it, deciding instead to send men with purses filled with gold to dissuade anyone not already joined from doing so. Around this time, John began to be known as the Kind, for his liberal nature and because his youthful extravagances had become less prominent against the background of 4 years of relative peace. All was well for a year, and on a spring day in May 1139, while thinking on his daughter, John received word of war at home, not from within, but from without. The King of France had raised his levies to war for the county of Maine. John's policy of pursuing external wars with his retinue, not his levy, was well founded, and he called his vassals to war without fear of rebellion or dissent. However, Aquitaine being far-flung and France being compact worked against John, and King Alain was able to bring Aquitaine's half-assembled levies to battle in Anjou in July 1139. John rushed home with his retinues, receiving word from a messenger who intercepted the Aquitanian fleet off the coast of Normandy that Count Hamelin had made his move to support Alessa de Poitou as the true ruler of Aquitaine. To make matters worse, in September John suffered dual defeats, first of the levies of Aquitaine, then of his retinue, who arrived too late to help the levies, but not too late to avoid interception by the weary but still large French host. Remembering his father's ways, King John II sent a call for hired companies, and in October enrolled the Breton band and the Saxon band in Bordeaux for service against France. While these companies mustered, John withdrew his host from northern Aquitaine and fled by boat to Bordeaux, where he joined these mercenary bands and marched east to meet the rebel host, crushing the host of the Duke of Gascogne and killing Mayor Urbingau in February 1140, then marching south into Marsan to put Gascogne on the defensive. Reports of victories and defeats began to come hot and heavy as King John the Kind of Aquitaine fought 3 wars at once in the summer of 1140. Can he defeat the combined hosts of France, Gascogne, and Limousin? And more importantly, can he put a boy child into the belly of the Queen Ide before she decides to take matters into her own hands? The start of the decade saw John the Kind fighting 3 wars, but he was able to maintain the upper hand against the rebellious faction seeking to place Alessa de Poitou on the throne of Aquitaine and prevent the King of France from making much headway against him in his war for Maine. By mid-April 1142, Count Pierre of Limousin sued for peace, and both he and the pretender to the throne were put in chains. Shortly after, another daughter, Ermesens, was born in May 1142, and John marched his host north to crush the King of France, securing his surrender in September of that same year. After disbanding his vassals' levies, King John fought for a short time in Sweden with his retinue in order to fulfill his obligations to an ally, but having no desire to tax his luck, returned home as soon as possible. John's domain being too large to administer properly, he granted the county of Nevers to a cousin, Vesian, in autumn of 1143. The land was peaceful, and John's coffers full, so he put masons to work building in all of his domain lands starting in November 1144, then moved his retinue south to crush a rebellion of peasants in Dax. John was able to improve his holdings again in May of 1145 to the delight of workmen across Aquitaine, and peace continued across the realm, with nothing more exciting than a feast held in January 1147 to drive the cold winter away. By winter, 2 years later in 1149, King John looked south at Rouergue, a rich county rightfully belonging to Aquitaine, and on Christmas Day delivered cartel and defiance to King Jourdain of France. John's levies marched into Rouergue and sacked its cities and castles by summer of 1150. The decade ends with John's host ready to march to Toulouse, where the French host lays siege, but a larger concern looms, that of the heir to Aquitaine. Queen Ide being far past the flower of youth, prospects are not bright for a boy heir. Will the proud Occitan lords of Aquitaine accept a woman as liege, or will there be war and division in the land of Aquitaine? As it turned out, King Jourdain of France had no stomach for war. After his host was defeated in Toulouse, Foix, and Carcassonne, he surrendered the county of Rouergue in November 1150. Just as John was settling into resignation about never having a son, Her Majesty Queen Ide shuffled off this mortal coil on the 26th of July, 1151. A good wife in all ways but one, John was torn between sadness at losing such a capable partner and hope that he might have a son. Though a devout sodomite, John knew his duty to the family well, and threw into marriage with a hot young wife from Ireland, who soon was teaching the aging king new tricks in the bedroom. John survived the heat of this new passion, and in July 1154 a third daughter, Alessa, was born. By 1155, growing increasingly impatient upon hearing that Sinead was with child a second time, he proclaimed that it had better be a boy, and in February 1156 his wishes were granted as John III came into the world at last. Sinead having served her purposes, John turned away from her, and instead of acceding to her suggestion that she introduce new fashions at court, suggested that they should instead go to church. Concerned at what the Queen's continually climbing atop his royal prerogative might yield in terms of additional heirs, John pressed for increased crown authority and changed the succession law of Aquitaine to primogeniture in 1158. To celebrate, John held a grand tournament, which, while costly, was somewhat anticlimactic as three rather middling jousters through trick of fate and dint of luck won out over the sturdier fighting men of the realm. To put away the disappointment of the not-so-grand tournament, King John called a grand hunt to be held. The hunt showed great promise, with hares and a mighty boar brought to bay soon, but when John grabbed a spear to do combat with a bear, his life was nearly taken and he was crippled for life. Crippled or no, Sinead was no less fervent in the bedroom, and by June 1159 she was showing with child a third time, and gave birth to a healthy boy, Raymond, in January 1160. King John, addled by tourney, hunt, maiming, feast, and sex, he set out to revoke the prince-bishopric of Agen for Raymond, not remembering that he had changed succession law in Aquitaine a short 18 months ago. The decade ended well, with John having mitigated some problems but now troubled by others. Over the years of peace, workmen built many new developments in John's domain holdings, and his chancellor roams the land securing goodwill for the aging king. Can he live long enough to allow John III to grow to manhood, or will Aquitaine have a boy king? John's frail constitution notwithstanding, he responded positively in 1162 to the King of England's request for aid against Duke Elfwine's attempt to take the throne. Thankfully, this war ended within a few months, and all was well. In 1163, John cast an ambitious eye south to Melguil, declaring war against the King of France in order to secure a port on the Mediterranean Sea. John the Kind support of the King of England was returned, and France could not long resist the combined force of England and Aquitaine. After a series of quickly conducted assaults in Melguil and Narbonne, France surrendered in March 1164. As John marched his levies home, word reached him that the Pope Mark II had declared a crusade for Jerusalem. John sent a quick rider east to the Holy See with word that he was right glad to do his devoir, then mustered his levies, landing them in Durham on the 22nd of September, 1164. By October, King John now being recognized as a crusader, the Aquitanian host crushed the infidel outside the gates of Harbigeat, and the remainder of Aquitaine's levies arrived in Ascalon in December. Sharp assaults on Ascalon, Harbigeat, and Ajalon followed, with the result that the county of Ascalon was fully controlled by John by March of 1165. John then marched as quickly as possible to Jerusalem, helping to bring low a large infidel host that same month. While laying siege to Durham in February 1166, a messenger brought word of the infidels' surrender, and that the kingdom of Jerusalem had been granted to King John the Kind, now king of Aquitaine and Jerusalem. John quickly called a council, created the duchies of Ascalon and Ultra-Jourdain, granted titles to his loyal vassals as equitably as possible, then returned to Aquitaine, crushing rebellions in Melguil and La Marche. A rebellion in Ascalon in 1167 forced King John to permanently station his retinue in the kingdom of Jerusalem, as the land, being largely Muslim, would not provide levies for its own protection. All the while, John III grew up bravely and under an open sky, promising to become a good king upon his father's death. Sinead, fertile as always, began to show yet again with child over Yuletide 1167. King John, feeling his life slipping away from him, declared war on the rebel Duke of Burgundy, hoping to join Maine by Anjou, then raised his host and flooded into that contested county. Burgundy proved stubborn, but by March 1169 sent word of surrender. As King John penned his acceptance, death took him on the 27th of March, 1169. King John II, called the Kind, had over his 35 years as king greatly expanded Aquitaine and secured his place in history. Can John III, brave lad though he is, follow in the very large footsteps of his grandfather and father, and preserve Aquitaine and the Kingdom of Jerusalem against the assaults that are sure to come. While at war with the Duke Gaucelin I of Burgundy for the county of Anjou, King John the Kind perished on the 27th of March 1169, having just put his seal to an acceptance of Burgundy's surrender. King John III, along in the host, and hoping to become a brave defender of the faith, sought out Jacques, Count of Nantes, for tutelage, then set about placating the vassals of Aquitaine in the usual manner with gold and honors. Berenguer de Souvigny was granted the county of Poitiers, and André de Inin the county of Bordeaux, at least until Jean could find pretext to reclaim them. Word came back from Burgundy that Anjou was now a vassal of Aquitaine on the 4th of April 1169, and the reign of John III began with a conquest that he didn't even have to fight for. On the word that Duke Blasi was filled with hatred for John III, men were sent to seize him, but he evaded capture and raised his levies in rebellion. In the winter of 1170, the young king had a close call with consumption, but happily it was not lasting. While John's host fought in Outremer, word arrived of a faction seeking lower crown authority in the realm, and their willingness to back words with force. Advised that his father had only instituted high law in order to obtain primogeniture, John gladly acceded to their reasonable demand, then continued with the war against Blasi, throwing him in the dungeon in May 1170. 2 peaceful years followed, with King John III reaching his majority in winter 1172. Owing to the mentorship of King John the Kind and Jacques, Count of Nantes, John III began adult life competent in all ways and a recognized expert in the art of war. King John married Bertha von Asperg in March of 1172, announcing his hope that a boy child would soon come. Peace prevailed in Aquitaine, with many new improvements to John domain strongholds and rapid conversion to Christianity of the counties in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. For John's constant efforts to win the Holy Land for Christendom and his sinless and courageous life, the Pope recognized John as a true Christian knight in 1174, greatly improving his position with the Church. Though no troubles vexed Aquitaine, King John fell ill with a lingering malady that hounded him from January 1175 until February 1176, boding ill for his longevity. In 1177, Queen Bertha finally showed with child, and in autumn of that same year a healthy daughter, Elaine, was born. In the winter of 1178, a feast that shall ever go down in the annals as the Great Feast of 1178 was held. King John had laid on a mountain of drink, which was consumed in an orgy of intoxication, puke and ruination of shoes, and enraged murder over the course of 26 days. All attendees left acknowledging that it was the year's best feast. Still hungover, King John declared war on Queen Catherine I of France for the county of Narbonne in March 1178. By April, France had called in Scotland on their side, and John responded by calling England in on Aquitaine's side. In March 1180, a second daughter, Ermesence, was born, and John continues beating upon French strongholds in Languedoc. Can John III conclude the war for Narbonne without complication? John was able to conclude his warlike business with France without interruption, and in August 1180 received of Queen Catherine I the county of Narbonne. To celebrate, John held a grand tournament. Then a peaceful decade began, with the most important business for many years being the many merchants pleading their love suits for the many daughters of the de Poitou dynasty. Not wishing to complicate succession, John held out for many years, but eventually gave in on some suits. John even had leisure to pursue gardening, a pastime that improved the administration of his domain. Remembering the great feast of 1178, John held another, and drunken hilarity ensued as nobles, remembering the fame of Count Fabrizio's shoes, tried to outdo one another in vomiting and murder. Peace could not last forever, and in 1189, Caliph Ismail called for a jihad against Genoa for the Kingdom of Mauritania. This was followed only months later by a second call for jihad. As if all of this were not enough, John lost his loyal steward Fabrizio. It is said the stress of planning the next feast was too much for him. The Maghreb is embroiled in war, and King John III stands on the verge of a momentous decision. Will he fight loyally for his ally Genoa, or will he further his own desire to build the Kingdom of Jerusalem to its rightful and just borders? The Usaid Sultanate locked into jihad with Genoa in the Maghreb. King John III considers launching a crusade of his own to build the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and declares holy war for the Duchy of Galilee on the 25th of February, 1190. This effort stretches Aquitaine's capacity for war to the limit, and a nervous campaign ensues, with thousands of men at arms braving the long ocean voyage to do battle in Outremer. Thankfully, the Usaid Sultanate cannot easily raise a host large enough to do battle against two foes at once, and John storms walled stronghold, city, and mosque without opposition in 1190. By March 1191, the war is close to over. However, while marching to storm the few remaining strong places in Safed, John hears word that at last a Saracen host marches east to undo his work. A pitched battle ensues before the gates of Tiberias, the Aquitanian host crushing the Saracens and retaking the birthplace of the Savior and the bishopric of Chastelet. Terms are put to Sultan Jalal al-Din the Cruel on the 25th of November, and the Duchy of Galilee falls to King John III. Within the year, King John then declares war on the Emir Sharif for Acre, the last county still under Muslim rule in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and grants leave for the Knights Templar to build the castle of Belvoir in Safed. John is able to quickly conclude this war, and on the 18th of September 1192, the Kingdom of Jerusalem in its entirety is under Aquitanian submission. As the echoes of John's triumphal celebration slowly fade, a boy, John, is born in January 1193. Within the fortnight, John is on campaign again, this time for the Sinai, a dusty expanse of lightly peopled sand to the south of Jerusalem. Barely rested from the previous year's campaign, Aquitaine again rises to do battle, loading men, weapons, provisions, and horses for war in the Sinai. Stretched this time beyond its native strength, King John hires the Breton Company and the Swiss Company in June 1193, bringing them to El Eilat to ensure the speedy defeat of the Saracen host at Arish in December, then marching east across the open desert to the Emirate of Baghdad. The exceeding dryness of Arabia introduces dangers as the hosts were forced to march separately. A second boy, Raymond, was born while John marched east, and as he moved deeper and deeper into Saracen lands, his heart was at ease that his line was doubly secure, and he was moved to express his love for Berkta, good wife she had been for all these years of toil and war. At the end of October 1195, Emir Tayyib I sent word of surrender, and Aquitanian Outremer obtained the 4 counties of the Sinai for Christendom. The Levant, being unable to raise its own defense, John raised additional retinues in the spring of 1197, and they arrived at the height of summer to bolster the young kingdom. In February of 1198, word came of the defeat of Genoa at the hands of Emir Wahid, while John's court chaplains worked ceaselessly to win the counties of Outremer for the cross. By July, glorious news of Genoa's successful defense against Caliph Davoud reached the Levant, and by 1199, the counties of Tyrus, Farama, and Eilat took the cross. The decade ends with the Kingdom of Jerusalem fully, if but tenuously, established in the Holy Land. John has led in numerous sieges, battles, ambushes, and diversions, always in the most dangerous place, to the very great glorification of his name. Disease runs rampant across the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the autumn of 1200, and King John flees it at the head of his host, taking refuge in Beirut. Restless in this self-imposed quarantine and noting gravely the division in the Holy Roman Empire, John stakes his amassed fortune and the lives of his men on a gambit for the county of Vivarais, rightfully belonging to Aquitaine. Respectful of the power that the Holy Roman Empire represents even in this weakened state, John contracts with the Swiss band and the Breton band, reliable companies who did good service for him in Outremer. So seriously does John take the coming battle that he undertakes the enormous task of bringing men from Outremer, leaving the Kingdom of Jerusalem undefended in the hope that he can beat down his foe the more rapidly. By June 1201, having yet to see armed opposition, but hindered by the relative scarcity of provender in Vivarais, Forez, and Vienne, John sends a force west around the rear of his hosts, intending to attack Bourgogne. The Holy Roman Empire's quiescence soon fades, as a large host appears in Savoy in August. Fearing the might of his foe, John breaks off from a stalled siege in Forez and reinforces the host in Vienne. This in turn gives pause to the imperial host, and they divert to Lyon, possibly to attempt to cut off John's smaller host in the north. John halts his forces moving south to Vienne and reinforces them in Forez from the forces in the north. The imperial host, not wishing to tangle with such a large mass of men, withdraws to Savoy, and John orders assaults in all places currently under siege. By December 1201, John gambles that the imperial host is in no mood to fight. Dividing his forces to avoid starvation in this thinly provisioned region, he attacks Savoy and Bourgogne simultaneously, but then decides to join his hosts in Bourgogne. This turns out to be propitious, as it draws out the imperial host, and a battle is fought in Genève at the turning of the year. John commits all of his forces into the battle, and over the course of 2 months of hard fighting wins a great victory. Unable to resist, the Holy Roman Empire surrenders Vivarais in April 1202. The county is obtained at the cost of several hundred gold and some 15,000 lives, and John is one step closer to restoring Aquitaine to its boundaries of old. 2 years later, in March 1204, John raises fire and sword to seize Carcassonne from France. The King of France, try though he might, could not resist, and surrendered Carcassonne before the end of the year. A period of generous spirit prevails in the wake of these victories, and John gives leave to his sister, Elaine, to marry the newly created Count of Carcassonne in 1205. Having no legal outlet for his acquisitive urges, King John hatches a plot to revoke the county of Bordeaux in 1206, favoring it as the seat of Aquitaine. Count Domingue, presented with a demand that he should relinquish the county, refuses, and is hauled off to the dungeon in short order. Continuing to feel secure, John married the Princess Ermesens to the Count of Safed in 1206, then moved the capital back to Bordeaux. The work begun by John I was finally completed in 1207, when the Duchy of Navarra became a legal entity of the Kingdom of Aquitaine. In January 1209, Prince John reached his majority. His youthful promise had come to full flower, though unlike his father, his skullduggery and scholasticism was somewhat weak. Prince Raymond reached his majority in 1210. A stronger diplomat and tactical commander than his older brother, he was nonetheless somewhat weak in other areas. Both sons of King John have great potential. King John the Great enters the winter of his life having accomplished many deeds, and having been considered a paragon of nobility for so long he cannot remember not being so thought. He closed out the last vestiges of his youth pondering a map of the de jure kingdoms of Europa, noting with concern the slow creep of England into France and Lotharingia into Burgundy. Troubled at being at a loss to address these matters, he dictates a letter to be handed to his sons on the occasion of his death. King John III had, over nearly 50 years of his reign, widely expanded the borders of Aquitaine and secured its status among the first powers in Christendom. He fought 3 wars in the Levant, at one point marching as far east as Baghdad. He fought wars in Europe against the Holy Roman Empire, France, Brittany, Orleans, and Vannes, losing none of them. During all of these travails, John lived a spotless life. Not once did he fall victim to any of the deadly sins, though as his body failed him, he did lose some courage and retired from the front of the host in battle. Atop all of this, he raised 2 paragons, losing one in battle against the petty King Conan of Brittany and having to rescue the other from the Prince-Bishopric of Agen. John fell ill in May of 1215 while fighting a war against France for Foix, the last France-controlled county in de jure Aquitaine. After subjugating Foix, John marched his armies north to meet the French host, crushing them at the Battle of Bourges on Christmas Day 1215. John received the French surrender of Foix on the 11th of January 1216, then marched his levies home. He delivered an address to his vassals and men on the 10th of February, thanking them for their hard work and dedication, then took leave of them. life slipped away from John in the early morning of the 11th of February, 1216. King John III, known as the Great, and having been widely reputed as a true Christian knight for over 40 years, lived well, bravely, and true, and left for his son a very large legacy. Can Raymond I carry on his father's work, or will he lose that which his forebears have won for him? Raymond I ascended to the kingship of Aquitaine in Jerusalem in February 1216 and immediately took steps to ingratiate himself with his vassals, divesting himself of his father's holdings in Foix, Cornwall, and Vannes. On the advice of his council, Raymond considered taking a wife, but put them off for a while, seeing no advantageous matches. Bored of administration, at the first opportunity he took to the hunt, establishing himself as an eager but ruthless hunter. It is rumored that when game was scarce, he hunted peasant children. While on the hunt, word came to him that his mother had passed of illness. The generation of his father was now truly past. As he was never close to her, he ordered yet another grand hunt, and then proclaimed a Yuletide feast to celebrate his new kingship while his vassals put down a rebellion in Brittany. Pestered by his steward, Raymond granted the Prince-Bishopric of Agen, the post he had held so briefly, to Jocelyn, the 7-year-old third son of the Count of Carcassonne. Hearing now that the King of Denmark's inheritance was in jeopardy, and his daughter young, brilliant, and unwed, Raymond married Princess Lise in April 1217, pocketing a tidy sum in wedding presents which he put to immediate work plotting to kill the infant Prince Olaf, her younger brother. It was not hard to find willing participants, but Olaf proved difficult to kill, finally succumbing on the third attempt in November 1218. Raymond's plot being concluded, he turned to Aquitaine's old enemy France, declaring war on King Colban I for Duke Arnaud's claim on the county of Tours. As the levies of Aquitaine assembled to do war with the Scots King of France, Raymond gave a thought to Queen Lise. Once she ascended to the throne of Denmark, how would he be able to prevent her from being killed by the same treacherous vassals who found it easy to smother a 2-year-old boy? While Raymond's men beat upon the strong places of France in the autumn of 1220, word came that Queen Lise had been blessed with child, and in March 1221, after a hard winter campaign, Raymond II was born. By August 1221, after a full year of wringing gold from King Colban's vassals and burghers, Raymond sent word that he had had enough, and the county of Tours came under Aquitanian jurisdiction. Taking stock of the situation in Denmark and the possibility that King Anders might choose to remedy his inheritance prospects, Raymond took positive action to secure that country for the de Poitou dynasty in 1222. As with other such murderous schemes in the land of Hamlet, willing conspirators were easy to find, and King Anders lay dead of poisoned wine before the year was out. Queen Lise, none the wiser, or perhaps even knowing of Raymond's killing her father, gave him a second son, Bertrand, in 1223. In 1224, hoping to bring all of Brittany under Aquitanian control, Raymond crushed the tiny host of Count Ealdred of Lyon. Ealdred fought valiantly, but hopelessly, surrendering at last after 6 months of war. In 1225, Raymond considered war with England, but hearing disturbing news from the east, decided against it. That same summer, a third son, John, was born, firmly securing the male line of the de Poitou dynasty in this generation. Around that same time, a portent of what was to come arrived in the form of an invitation to war on Venice and the depraved Doge Sinibaldo, which Raymond refused. A few months later, while putting down a revolt in Jerusalem, Raymond received new word regarding Venice. He would not refuse the call of Pope Sixtus IV, who declared a crusade to recover Sicily from Sinibaldo's heretical hands, and by May 1226 stood with his host in Reggio, recognized as a crusader and protector of the faith. War cruel and sharp followed, with Aquitanian soldiery always pushing hard on Sinibaldo's castles and towns. By June 1226, Raymond had brought some 25,000 men to Sicily, and by August laid siege in western Sicily with nearly 40,000 men, breaking down Alcarno, Mazzara, Trapani, and the trade post of Trapani in the space of a week. By October, with no less than 80,000 men at arms trampling Sicily down, Sinibaldo acceded to the Pope's demands that he surrender his holdings in the Kingdom of Sicily, and Raimond was crowned King of Sicily on the 30th of October, 1226. Wanting to consolidate Sicily as rapidly as possible, Raimond declared war on Count Oresti of Bari in December 1226, but the messenger did not arrive, and Raimond was forced to recall his men and declare war again in February 1227. By April 1227, however, Raimond realized he had made a grave error in retaining the titles granted to him by the Pope, and Aquitaine's vassals, great and small, seethed with anger at him. The war was called off, but Raimond was able by June 1227 to attempt a third time for Bari, this time declaring war on Sinibaldo the Accursed. Before Raimond could bring that war to a successful conclusion, Doge Sinibaldo died under suspicious circumstances, and it was war again with Count Orestes, who surrendered Bari in April 1228. Raimond followed this conquest with wars for Brundisian and Reggio, both added to Aquitanian Sicily by autumn 1228. Unable to justly complete the subjugation of Calabria, Raimond launched a plot to kill Duke Osbern II on Christmas Day 1228. Osbern, however, proved difficult to kill, and 1229 passed uneventfully, Raimond consolidating his power in Sicily and moving the capital of Aquitaine to Messina. He hoped soon to be able to obtain Catanzaro, Taranto, Salerno, and Amalfi, the remaining counties of Sicily, but understands that he may be forced to take extraordinary steps to achieve that with any sort of haste. Though slow in the execution, King Raimond was able to effect the death of Duke Osbern in the summer of 1231. Within weeks, the levies of Aquitanian Sicily poured into Catanzaro, overcoming Countess Elisande's token forces and compelling her surrender in January 1232. During this short campaign, another son, Henri, was born to Raimond and Lise. Seeing that the Republic of Pisa was engaged in a war, Raimond decided to declare war for Taranto in 1232. Unable to effectively mount a defense, the Serene Doge Arsenio the Cruel was forced to accommodate Aquitaine's demands after only 9 months of one-sided war. In the east, the weakened Muslim world declared jihad for Armenia in April 1233, but the Byzantine Empire, yet strong, crushed the Muslim hosts and Caliph Ismail was forced to call it off in February 1234. Meanwhile, Raimond granted bishoprics in Aquitanian Outremer to Bertrand and John, eliminating the risk of a fractured inheritance for Raimond II. In order to obtain a de jure claim on the county of Rennes, Raimond created the Duchy of Brittany, granting it to Count Milo of Carcassonne. Worried at the prospect of young Raimond II being thrust into the kingship of Denmark and choosing his wife poorly, Raimond secured a betrothal to the gifted Ermengarde Otakarin in 1234. Raimond reached adulthood in March 1237. Acceptably competent and a gifted strategist, he nonetheless has about him a slack-jawed appearance doubtless coming from his mother's side. While Raimond oversaw the construction of improvements, court chaplain Bishop Albric of La Salve sent word that Aquitanian Outremer had been largely won over for the cross. This work of 70 years done, he was recalled to Messina. In April 1238, Raimond decided to assassinate Serene Doge Ugo II of Pisa so that he could declare war for Salerno. The campaign was costly and protracted, but on the fourth attempt, Ugo fell to the assassin's blade. Serene Doge Ugo's blood not even congealed, a declaration of war was thrown at the feet of Serene Doge Umberto, and a stout war commenced through the fall of 1238. Meanwhile, Raimond's chancellor secured a claim to Évreux in English Normandy. Not wishing to drag the war on longer than necessary, Raimond laid demands before Pisa in February 1239, which were accepted. Having claims on Mortagne and Évreux, Raimond planned a feast to improve his standing with his vassals as the decade closed out. Can John wrest English Normandy from King Ealdmund the Great? In 1240, King Raimond pursued his war for Normandy, pressuring the boy king Randolph I for his claims. After a series of sieges in Mortagne, Evreux, and Rouen, Randolph chose to surrender Mortain and Evreux on the 1st of April, 1241. That war concluded, Raimond warred upon the breakaway county of Rennes, subjugating the boy Earl Fulk rather handily by August 1241. King Raimond, desirous of seeing members of his dynasty with landed title, granted Mortain to Raimond Berenguer and Evreux to Giordano de Poitou in November 1241. In an effort to better organize the war-fighting capacity of the Kingdom of Aquitaine, and also for the increase of the prestige of the de Poitou dynasty, Raimond created the duchies of Benevento, Calabria, Toulouse, Jerusalem, Apulia, and Bourbon in December of 1241 and created 6 new dukes. Feeling that Ermengarde Taquerin might soon grow too old to reliably provide children to Prince Raimond, King Raimond permitted his son to marry at long last, if only to prevent bastards from populating the royal castle. That same year, Raimond imprisoned Charles, Duke of Navarre and Gascogne, for attempting to fabricate a claim on the Kingdom of Aquitaine. In 1244, the nobles of Aquitaine took matters into their own hands and conspired to see Gascogne granted to a new ruler, one with less ambition than the de Béarn dynasty had become infamous for. Meanwhile, the always busy Chancellor of Aquitaine forged a claim upon the French county of Vendôme, for the control of which Aquitaine went to war with Orléans in January 1245, securing it after 5 months of pleasant enough siege, then granting it to a kinsman, Guitart de Poitou, in August 1245. Never one to be gentle in dealing with threats, in 1246 King Raimond killed Duke Arnaud I of Auvergne in order to prevent him from fabricating a claim on the Kingdom of Aquitaine. In 1247 an unexpected turn of events occurred. 5 years after marrying Raimond II, and still without child, Ermengarde Taquerin approached King Raimond with an arrangement that he found impossible to refuse, Queen Lise having been in Denmark for many years. 9 months later, Raimond II proudly proclaimed the birth of his son, Raimond III, to the court of Aquitaine, while Ermengarde and King Raimond smiled at each other behind his back. In 1248, Chancellor Gaston reported the conclusion of a majestic work of forgery, fraud, and traducement, opening the possibility of a massive increase in Aquitaine's holdings at the expense of France. Raimond went to war with King Ranald immediately for the Duchy of Orléans, burning castles and crushing the French host mercilessly over the next year, forcing Ranald to the humiliating surrender of 3 counties to Aquitaine in 1249. Ever whimsical in such matters, Raimond granted the county of Blois and the Duchy of Orléans to a 15-year-old boy he had never met, merely because he was a distant relative. Raimond celebrated his victories on the battlefield and the boudoir with a grand hunt, and, bold there as always, faced down a pack of wolves without regard to his personal safety, then slaked his lust upon his son's wife, making sure that he was busy on the honorable chore of providing meat for the year's Yuletide feast. As the echoes of raucous celebration died in Raimond's hall in the spring of 1250, and the steward washed the vomit from his shoes, fanciful tales of strangely accoutered savages from across the sea reached Raimond, along with the threat that they would return to visit a terrible reckoning upon the lords of Christendom. King Raimond, not easily swayed by such tales, gave no thought to them and turned his thoughts instead to how he would order his kingdom in the waning years of his life. In 1250, ignoring these strange rumors, Raimond set about pursuing his new love of cavalry, building jousting lists across Aquitaine and instructing the marshal to focus on mounted combat. Meanwhile, his love affair with Ermengarde only grew stronger, and in the summer of 1251 she reported that she was with her father-in-law's child again, giving birth to a second son, Renaud, who King Raimond's son took to be his own. In the summer of 1252, the land being peaceful, and King Raimond being desirous of seeing the results of his recent equestrian pursuits, a grand tournament was held. This resulted in some unfortunate deaths among the less stout gentry. King Raimond, for his part, swept the field, proving himself at the age of 57 to be the strongest fighting man in Aquitaine. In the summer of 1253, avoiding Queen Lise as he had become wont, King Raimond arranged a ball, during which he put child in Ermengarde's belly a third time. Almost immediately after, a hue and cry that a horde of hideous demon-worshipping marauders had arrived in the Bretagne coast reached Raimond's ears in Messina. The levies of Aquitaine were roused, with instructions to assemble in Auvergne and await reinforcement, but by November it had become clear that these supposed marauders were the ravings of frightened fools or opportunists, and the levies were sent home. In 1254, Ermengarde gave birth to a daughter by King Raimond, who, like the boys preceding her, were accepted as Prince Raimond's own. It was about at this time that King Raimond began thinking his son a fool. Later that same year, King Raimond undertook to teach his son Raimond as a possible heir, and the boy took to the lessons hungrily, learning the art of skilled dissemblage naturally, and while he did not adopt temperation as eagerly, at least he did not earn a reputation for vile gluttony. While Raimond tutored young Raimond, news came to his ears of a crusade for Hungary against the vile Kagan Klaghagan of the Golden Horde. Not eager to participate, King Raimond nonetheless did his duty and added his name to the roll of crusaders, while a club-footed daughter, Mabila, was announced to the world as the fourth child of Prince Raimond and Ermengarde. King Raimond's disappointment in his heir was balanced by the joy of seeing his younger son wax kind as he accompanied his granddad on crusade. Raimond reached Hungary in January 1258, but hearing of a huge Mongol host approaching, diverted south to avoid crushing defeat. By summer, however, Raimond was able to aid in the siege of Sorna, but his anger upon seeing the disorganized state of the Christian host sat sore with him, and he lost his heart of kindness. Before long, the Mongol host attempted to come to grips with Aquitaine's small host, and Raimond decided that discretion being the better part of valor, it was better to depart the seat of war and return to his homelands in Messina. Embittered by being apart from Ermengarde, and knowing that Hungary must necessarily remain in Mongol hands, Raimond reacted violently to the plotting of his kinsmen Count Jacme and Count Milo, sentencing them to death at the hands of assassins in the winter of 1258. These uncharacteristic direct actions, however, took their toll on the aging king, and by spring 1259 worry creased his brow. But King Raimond found joy in the raising of his secret son, who rather unlike his father developed a streak of bravery. Winter 1259 found King Raimond troubled about how to proceed. His son, Prince Raimond, while competent enough, had never impressed him, and his continued blindness as regards his children marked him as a fool. King Raimond created the Duchy of Sinai in 1260, granting it to Count Amalric of Sinai. He then put his son, Raimond, at the head of the army of Aquitaine and sent him to quell rebellion in Catanzaro, then later that same year in Reggio. Ever ambitious, the son Raimond asked for a fief, and not wanting to anger him, King Raimond at last promised to arrange it. By October 1261, King Raimond attempted to escape the pressures of the life he had chosen by granting gifts and honors to Ermengarde, and by the middle of that month received some relief. For her part, however, Ermengarde was unable to escape the veil of depression that had haunted her whole life. In 1262 the crisis point was reached regarding Prince Raimond. King Raimond, having long not wanted to pass the kingship of Aquitaine to his half-Danish son, had it out with him, then took stock of his son by Ermengarde. Deciding that he could not afford to put it off any further, King Raimond sent assassins to kill his son, who died in a suspicious accident on the 26th of January 1262. That same day Raimond sent swift rider to the Pope with a plea for divorce from his wife, Lise. Word came swiftly back that the divorce was granted. Less than a fortnight after his son's death, King Raimond was married to the troubled Ermengarde Otakaran. In March 1262, the crusade for Hungary was declared a failure, and the wounded from across Christendom trudged home, having been defeated by the Mongols. In 1263, the Pope granted Raimond absolution for the sin of kinslaying, and the King of Aquitaine sighed relief that his immortal soul was no longer in grave danger. Later that same year, King Raimond, mindful of Aquitaine's future, betrothed his heir and grandson to the 10-year-old Duchess of Ferrara. His life's work largely complete, and Ermengarde now given over to celibacy, Raimond sought a good death in the hunt, but instead had to be satisfied with once again proving his manhood on wolves and boars. The boy Raimond, on his own account, became a fine man and heir, showing talent and strategy and a brace of fine personal traits, if not comprehensive mastery of all subjects. Having obtained a legal enough-looking claim on Rouen, Raimond presented it to Count Rourg of the same, declaring war in January 1264. Before he could bring that war to a conclusion, Count Rourg surrendered to the Queen of France, and Raimond satisfied himself with feasting instead. However, in April 1264, Raimond sent word to the Queen of France that Rouen would be his, by sword and fire, and he raised his levies against France one last time. King Raimond the Apostle succumbed peacefully to old age on the 30th of August 1264, having ruled for nearly 50 years, during which he added to Aquitaine half of English Normandy, the entirety of the Duchy of Orleans, and the Kingdom of Sicily, 22 counties in all. Raimond warred with England, France, Venice, Pisa, and the Holy Roman Empire, married a princess of Denmark, then killed her younger brother and her father, then later sired 3 children by his son's wife. During all of this time, Raimond never shirked a feast or hunt, daring death by overindulgence in drink, bear's claw, or boar's tusk more times than could be easily counted. He slew king, duke, and count with impunity, even killing his own son on the suspicion that he might be plotting the same for him, then divorced the Queen of Denmark and took his son's wife as his own. He leaves a mighty kingdom to his young son, Raimond II, having lived richly indeed. Raimond II assumed the kingship of Aquitaine, Sicily, and Jerusalem in 1264, then after arranging the kingdom's affairs, continued to prosecute war against France for Rouen. After crushing the remnants of the French host before the gates of Paris, he was awarded that county by Queen Marie of France. In October 1265, the Emperor Sebastianus Ducas declared war on Raimond for the county of Foggia, a de jure holding of Byzantium. Within months, Raimond landed men-at-arms from Jerusalem on Cyprus, where they unwittingly did battle against an enemy of Byzantium, losing when a Byzantine host arrived, then evacuating to Sicily, where they won Aquitaine's first victory in Catanzaro in May 1266. The host of Aquitaine, now 46,000 strong, marched north to Salerno, where it was augmented by other levies until it swelled to nearly twice that size, and then marched north, giving battle in Apulia in August 1266. Aquitaine swept the field at Cannae in September 1266, then after settling affairs in Foggia, invaded Byzantium, compelling the emperor to pay war reparations in April 1267. Hearing that his vassals in Aquitania and Outremer were restive, Raimond sent his tired levies there to await the inevitable rebellion, which erupted in the summer of 1267. Raimond was wounded in battle, but was able to direct the submission of his rebel lords from his tent, and even saw to the marriage of his brother, Renaud, to the Duchess of Bohemia, before bringing his wayward vassals to heel in April 1268, imprisoning several dukes and counts and extracting rich ransoms from them. Still wounded, he walked the aisle with Duchess Adelheid of Ferrara, not admiring her as a person so much as an investment in 5 counties in northern Italy. Raimond finally healed of his grievous wound in the summer of 1269, earning a reputation as a tough lord in battle and one not easily to succumb to death. Finally fit again for combat, he declared a grand tournament, sending word from Brittany to Carac inviting men-at-arms to compete à Plaisance. His cousin, Carlos de Poitou, was maimed during the proceedings, which were won by a low-born fellow of no martial account named Adalbert, a masterful schemer and paranoiac. Suspicious of the outcome of the tournament, but powerless to find satisfaction, Raimond turned instead to a Prusium, where he sent his chancellor to forge claims on the counties of Spoleto. He intends to join Sicily and Aquitaine by land, and this is the first step in a campaign that will define his reign. The 1270s started out peacefully enough. In 1273, Raimond II undertook to divide his retinue so as to have force on hand to quell rebellion in Sicily and Outremer, relying on native levies in Old Aquitaine. Later that same year, Raimond gave up lies and decided on the policy of truth, becoming a spotless man at the young age of 25. About this time, Raimond received reports that the Holy Roman Empire was at war, with Kaiserin Frederica I likely to lose to Duke Siegfried the Old. Also that the jihad for Egypt against Pisa had failed. Duchess Adelheid, though married to King Raimond II for 4 years, was still without child in the summer of 1273, a worrisome development. In the autumn of 1273, King Raimond discovered that his grandmother Queen Lise of Denmark had passed, and that the Kingdom of Denmark was no more, having been absorbed by surrounding powers. His father's schemes and plots had, through the vagaries of war, come to naught. In June 1274, King Raimond granted the Prince-Bishopric of Vivarais to his kinsman, young Jacques de Poitou, a lad renowned for his quick wit and prodigious learning, then gave him a gift of gold to ensure his prosperity. As the winter of 1274 came on, good news finally reached Raimond of Adelheid's being with child, and hope sprang forth for a strong boy to carry on the line. Aquitaine having been at peace for years, and Pisa's vassals unhappy with serene Doge Adalberto, Raimond declared war for Amalfi, the last county of the Kingdom of Sicily not under Aquitanian control. Raimond attacked Adalberto at 3 points, north, south, and east. While on campaign, Raimond received word of the birth of Elaine, his first daughter. Pisa put on a strong fight, and Raimond was forced to retreat at first, barely escaping from Bari by ship and dissolving his levies into the hills in September 1275. Raimond quickly reversed Aquitaine's fortunes, crushing an expedition from Pisa in the Sinai and taking Mayor Vittore prisoner. In September 1276, Pisa brought the smaller Aquitanian host to grips at the coastal fortress of Sorrento. Raimond quickly dispatched vessels to bring reinforcements from sieges in northern Africa, and the outnumbered and battered host was saved on the 17th of October, winning the great victory at Sorrento over the next month. After a long and sometimes chancy war, Pisa was forced to surrender Amalfi, and Sicily was finally made whole under Raimond II, now known as the Wise for his sinless and well-regarded rule over Aquitaine. Raimond was quick to grant the new gains to kinsmen. Jacques de Poitou was made mayor of Capri, Savaric de Poitou was made baron of Sorrento, and Albert de Poitou was made Lord Mayor and Count of Amalfi. Before the dust could settle from the war for Amalfi, word came that Chancellor Yassar had created a legal fiction granting Raimond right to the Duchy of Spoleto, and Aquitaine's levies roused themselves again, invading that small Italian dukedom in the spring of 1277. Unable to resist Aquitaine's might, Duke Hartwig was forced to surrender his 2 counties and sent word to Raimond, now racked with campaign fever, that he would accede to Aquitanian overlordship. It took almost 2 years for Raimond to recover, but thankfully this time was peaceful, and Raimond granted the new holdings in Spoleto to Boisson de Poitou, to the increase of the de Poitou dynasty's fame and glory. January 1280 finds Raimond without male heir, but a single daughter, Elaine, growing well and set to inherit a vast kingdom and empire in all but name. In the summer of 1280, rebellion broke out in Orléans, and levies were raised from Blois to put it down, but the peasants, upon hearing that a well-armed and organized host was assembling to slaughter them, put down their flaming sticks and went home. Later that same summer, Chancellor Yassine forged a claim on Eu, and Raimond declared war upon King Jocelyn III of England in August 1280 for the counties of Eu and Vexin in English Normandy. A complicated battle ensued. with men-at-arms shipping across the Seine to do battle with England, finally forcing a pitched battle in Évreux in February 1281. The vastly outnumbered English had little chance. Raymond, for his part, learned much of the ways of war, and became a renowned cavalry leader in the summer of 1281. A few months later, Eu and Vexin being completely subdued, King Raymond prepared to bring desolation to England itself, but King Jocelyn thought better of it, and surrendered his 2 counties to Raymond on the 23rd of August 1281. In the autumn of 1281, Raymond heard tell that the Pope considered him, like his great-grandfather John III, a true Christian knight, to his very great honor, and his daughter, Elaine, showed signs of following in her father's ways, adopting a brave attitude. Meanwhile, Occitan culture made headway in Aquitanian Sicily, with 3 counties of the formerly Berber island of Sicily adopting Occitan ways, and 2 counties in Italy doing so. In March 1286, a second daughter, Eleanor, was born to Adelheid, furrowing Raymond's brow even though she was in all ways a fine girl and free of blemish, while Elaine continued to blossom as a skilled twister of the truth, adopting deceit when prompted by her father. But unfortunately, Elaine began to show signs of twisted cruelty unabated by Raymond's urgings toward kindness. Raymond's mother, Ermengarde Tacarin, perished in February 1288, having lived a long and full life. The shaper of Aquitaine's future, she was finally free of the depression that had hounded her for decades. In the summer of 1289, Raymond hesitated for a moment, considering whether to pursue a dalliance with a low-born courtier, Philomena, but increasingly desperate for a son, decided to go into her bedchamber. Love quickly blossomed between king and low-born lady, but Raymond thought himself possibly the target of his wife's jealous rage in September 1289, when Prince Eudes was killed by an infidel assassin. In April 1290, a miracle of sorts occurred, and Philomena brought into the world the son that Queen Adelheid had failed to produce. Not only that, the brightness of young William was apparent to all, and Raymond quickly moved to recognize him as a legitimate son, shocking his wife and courtiers but delighting his lover and solving his inheritance problems, or so he thought. Adelheid, perhaps sensing the competition his lover had raised, announced her pregnancy immediately after. May 1290 finds King Raymond the Wise faced with a complicated family situation. His son, Prince William, though legitimized by law, is still not the rightful heir of Aquitaine. Elaine, his brave, deceitful, and cruel daughter and rightful heir to Aquitaine and Ferrara, may choose to take matters into her own hands. And what of Adelheid, doubtless enraged by Raymond's infidelity and shocking expediency? In 1290, troubled by the as yet unsettled succession in Aquitaine, Raymond distracted himself by attending to his domain lands, building improvements in all of them. In the autumn of that same year, Adelheid gave birth to a third daughter, Elessa. Raymond, busy with other matters, was not aware that this birth made William his sole heir and disinherited Eleanor and Elaine, who became recognized as a brilliant strategist like her father upon her majority in the summer of 1291, though she had glaring weaknesses in diplomacy and theological learning. Elaine was betrothed to Ancel, the Duke of Ultra-Jourdain, in an effort to bring that duchy under the de Poitou dynasty. In 1292, Europe roused itself on the call of Pope Constantine III for a second crusade for Hungary. Raymond, having heard stirring tales of battles that had won Jerusalem and Sicily for Aquitaine, raised his entire levy and began moving them toward Hungary. For better or worse, he chose to march his hosts overland rather than the more difficult-to-administer sea route, and they arrived in Esztergom in May 1293, winning a victory at Ogyala and capturing Chief Belgutai. The Mongols were quick to respond, crushing a host of Aquitaine at Comorom the same month, and another at Sarbogard in August. By January 1294, Aquitaine's 32,000 remaining men-at-arms fled before the might of Kagan Chilagun, but were surrounded by a cloud of horse archers at the field of Sarbogard on the 11th, and killed to a man after 10 days of horrible siege. Defeated, Raymond set to work reconstituting the retinue of Aquitaine around a corps of mounted men-at-arms 8,000 strong. In 1295, King Raymond recognized his son William as his rightful heir, who, at the age of 5, was already Raymond's equal in theological matters and a superior diplomat, wise beyond his tender years. That notwithstanding, Raymond undertook to teach him the ways of kingship, hoping to continue the line of wise Aquitanian kings unabated. William quickly established himself as an unabashed daredevil, which Raymond felt compelled to accept as the child's nature, encouraging honesty in the young genius. In June 1297, news reached the now sun-besotten king of Aquitaine that Hungary had been lost a second time, but he paid it little notice, hoping to forget his failures there and busy with a small rebellion in Mortagne. William continued to grow, developing a reputation for charity which would serve him well as king. In 1299, while spending time with his son, King Raymond succumbed to a stroke and fell dead on the 28th of May. King Raymond ruled Aquitaine for 35 years, expanding its borders little, but ejecting England from France. He also undid the work of his father, which would have brought the 5 counties of Ferrara under his heir's rule. He also led tens of thousands of Aquitanian men to their deaths at the hands of heathen Tengri hordes in Hungary in an ill-managed debacle. However, he did secure an unbroken inheritance for his son, William, whose brilliance may usher in 50 years of unparalleled might. While not the greatest of Aquitanian kings, Aquitaine did not grow weaker or smaller under Raymond II. The question now is whether the boy King William will be able to face down internal and external threats and establish his own legacy. After seeing to his father's funerary honors, William saw to the vassals of Aquitaine, spending thousands of gold nobles to buy their loyalty, or at least their acquiescence to his rule. Realizing the value of education, William lured Guy Scarpenois, the talented Chancellor of Verdun, to his court, and then asked him to be his mentor. Shortly after ascending to the throne of Aquitaine, William discovered that his older sister, Elaine, was plotting against his life, and he challenged her directly, obtaining her apology for attempting such a course of action. Before the year was out, William's spymaster detected that Duke Galbert of Gascogne also plotted to kill William, and he, too, shamefacedly begged forgiveness for his treachery. Sensing that rebellion was likely among the lords of Old French Aquitaine, Raymond concentrated his levies there, moving them from Jerusalem and Sicily and posting them in Limousin. During all of this, William had time to be just a boy, forming tight friendships with Constance and Mathieu Scarpenois, children of his mentor. By August 1300, William had assembled an 8,000-man force in Limousin under Tord af Lahome, prepared to deal with any trouble that might arise. This appeared to work, and in 1301 King William held a great feast to increase his standing with the nobles of Aquitaine. The standard mayhem ensued, and young King William was nearly forced to suspend the festivities when Bishop Perenudit had some wine spilled on him and cut the throat of a clumsy servant. After a month of debauchery and murder, however, the lords of Aquitaine went home sated, agreeing that William at least knew how to entertain in grand style. In 1303, Queen Mother Philomena stepped in to become regent for William, and it soon became apparent that his mother had become prone to fits of speaking in tongues as if possessed by devils. William recoiled in horror, wondering what this might mean for him. By the summer of 1304, William began to feel his efforts to assert himself bear fruit, as he successfully appealed the excommunication of Duke Tancred, winning his loyalty. Later that year, William proposed a betrothal to the young and renowned Gerberg de Bechalmont, a young lady his intellectual equal and just as zealous. In 1305, concerned that Aquitaine's vassals had still not come to respect him as king, William distributed large sums from his coffers to buy loyalty he otherwise could not obtain. This seemed to produce the desired effect. A dangerously powerful faction seeking lowered crown authority disappeared, and another desiring independence stayed their hands. In 1306, an indication of weak character showed itself in William when he began to question whether the laws of man or God applied to him, a worrisome sign that may lead to future trouble. This tendency to think himself above the law is, however, well-founded, with William reaching his majority possibly the most gifted diplomat in the known world and a masterful tactician and theologian. Marrying the similarly blessed but less able Gerberg de Beauchamont, the potential exists for a line of wildly superior de Poitou kings and queens. William was jarred out of a peaceful year of rule in 1307 by the revelation that his mother was plotting some dire thing. What, however, he could not ascertain, giving rise to unease and the suspicion that enemies might be lurking anywhere in Aquitaine. These doubts, however, did not prevent William from increasing his hold on Aquitanian Sicily, where he increased crown authority in 1308 to the ready approval of the lords there. A few months later, perhaps finding themselves without anyone else with whom they could easily converse, William and Gerberg became devoted lovers, pledging their undying love to one another. This love blossomed in 1309, with Gerberg becoming with child in June. A daughter, Elaine, was born in 1310, with eyes every bit as intelligent as her mother's and father's. March 1310 finds Aquitaine hopeful for even greater prospects, with towering figures ruling it and only cruel fate its enemy. King William started his second decade of kingship still needing to dispense large sums of gold to Aquitaine's fractious nobles, who had become increasingly willing to resort to private violence. Moreover, though clearly a cut above other men, William's personal character was in doubt, as he had slipped into arbitrariness and was no longer as diligent as he once was. However, William was able to re-establish himself as a just ruler in 1311, imprisoning Baron Bartholomew for killing an offending servant, and as a kind man caring for the strong and weak alike, stemming his decline before it could go far. As a de Poitou king, William was an avid hunter, fearlessly pitting himself against all manner of beasts, and building his repute as a man well capable of handling what needs to be done. Having no son, William gave a gift of gold to his queen Gerberg and made her High Almoner, hoping to incite her love, and furthermore, hedging against the possibility that no son might come, betrothed his daughter Elaine to the master spy, Elif Severison. Gerberg proceeded to provide 3 daughters to William, Elessa in 1315, Eleanor in 1317, and Ermengarde in 1319, to his very great astonishment and vexation. Unable to deal with these excess heirs in the same manner as boys, by putting them in bishoprics, William moved in 1320 to take steps to institute primogeniture so that Elaine, now growing to be a formidable daughter, might have Aquitaine undivided. But hope still lingers that a boy might make all of this unnecessary. King William the Wise was granted his wish on the 7th of July, 1322, when a bright-eyed boy, John, was born at last. A great rejoicing went out through the land as Aquitaine's future was assured, at least as long as the boy lived. Meanwhile, William's crafty mentor, Guy Scarpenois, roamed France building a case for war, penning forged claims to Charolais in 1322, Macon in 1323, and Dion in 1324. Prince John showed early signs of intellectual curiosity, and at the age of 4 became reputed as a cynic, questioning everything and believing nothing on faith. In 1327, Pope Simplicius II called a third crusade for Hungary. William, eager to avoid the shame of being thought a hangback, joined, but led only a small host to Brno. Hearing of a battle to the south, he led his small troop there and took command of a larger Christian host at the Battle of Bazin in March 1328, winning a victory there and securing the love of the Holy See. He then led his host back to Aquitanian Sicily, knowing from history and from having sat at his father's knee during the Second Crusade for Hungary that the Golden Horde was an unconquerable foe. In the meantime, an Aquitanian duke had taken matters into his own hands, seizing the county of Troyes from France, which was now racked by internal war. William declared war for Charolais and Dijon immediately, hoping to at least obtain those two counties rather than lose the work of his chancellor. The levies of Old Aquitaine assembled, then invaded France, compelling the beleaguered Queen Marie II to surrender in April 1239. The child Countess Marguerite of Macon soon followed in 1239, unable to withstand the force of Aquitaine, and France was reduced to pitiful straits, holding but a single county, Vermandois. January 1330 finds Aquitaine on the verge of empire. While receiving a report of the various nefarious deeds of the courtiers of Aquitaine, William came to the conclusion that he was surrounded by vipers, and lost any urge to charity toward them. However, his long tenure as king had subdued even the most angry and ambitious of Aquitaine's vassals, and at long last not even one of them was hostile to William's rule. Young Prince John, however, proved vexatious, developing a streak of arbitrariness to accompany his disbelief and cynicism. Seeing that the Holy Roman Empire had dissolved or absorbed the Kingdom of France, William created himself King of France on the 25th of January 1332, finishing the long work of his line and completing the domination of France. In recognition of the long and loyal service of his mentor and chancellor Guy Scarpenois, William created him Count of Dijon and Duke of Burgundy. At ends as to what to do about the increasingly wayward Prince John, William took his side when he called a courtier fat, at least encouraging honesty in the cynical and arbitrary lad. Quick on the heels of this double-edged success, however, came the terrible news that the city of Belgrade had been razed to the ground on the 19th of July, 1332, a day that will live forever as a reminder of the savagery of the Golden Horde. As if this were not enough, William's old mentor and prop, Duke Guy, perished unto his death in October 1332, at least living to see his line established as nobles of Aquitaine. By 1333, the Holy Roman Empire seized the county of Reims, to William's consternation and worry. In a continuing trend of bad news, Pope Simplicius II was forced to admit that Christendom could not wrest Hungary from the Golden Horde in January 1334. However, all was not shadow. John, now reaching answers to his youthful wanderings and inquiries, developed a love for justice, hard work, and kindness, warming his father's heart. Over all of this loomed a difficult-to-resolve crisis. The Holy See's repeated failure to dislodge the Golden Horde from Hungary had severely weakened its credibility, and reports of spreading heresy reached William in Messina. Good news, however, came in the form of Prince John, who upon his majority was recognized as a paragon in all fields of human endeavor, and possibly the most able man in all of Europe. January 1330 finds King William faced with a decision, whether to declare himself Emperor of Francia or remain just a king, an emperor in all but name. His decision will determine the fate of Western Europe for decades, if not centuries to come. Upon discovering that he could not crown himself Emperor of Francia, William stretched out his sword to his neighbors, seizing Forez and Vienne before summer's end, but drawing war from Byzantium, who must have thought Aquitaine unable to defend itself. William completed the seizing of Chalon, then turned on Lotharingia in a bid to take Reims while that kingdom was temporarily free of the Holy Roman Empire. Through hard fighting and much sacrifice of life, William was able to successfully prosecute his claim on Reims, but is forced to surrender Salerno to the Byzantine emperor, having overstretched the resources of Aquitaine to his loss. Stinging from this defeat, William declared himself Emperor of Francia and King of Aquitaine, Sicily, and Jerusalem on the 13th of April, 1342. Desiring to continue to prosecute wars of conquest against Lotharingia, William undertakes assassination as a way to bypass legal hindrances to his plans. Poisoned wine is tried without success, but a more unconventional approach featuring the use of manure and a match clears the way for another war against Lotharingia, this time for both the county and the Duchy of Provence, which William seizes in July 1345. The next year, William makes war on Kaiser Emilrich of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is divided and at war with itself, and William takes Bourgogne without great difficulty. In 1347, Salerno, having thrown off the Byzantine yoke, finds itself under the forcible overlordship of Aquitaine once more. Later that same year, the voracious appetite of William for land is kindled towards Ancona, which surrenders to Aquitaine in November 1347, all its strong places occupied by Aquitanian fighting men. In 1349, a plot to kill Prince John is uncovered, and William launches a counterplot against the perpetrator. The decade closes out with William planning a feast to seek out and recruit courtiers loyal to his cause. "284 years have passed since 1066, and William I, great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Guillaume VIII, Duke of Aquitaine, now rules over a mighty empire spanning from the Breton coast to the Arabian desert. Having grown from a powerful duchy in France, Francia is now comprised of hundreds of holdings, ruled by dozens of lords held together by the might of the de Poitou emperors from the Purple Throne in Messina. Unusual for a realm this size, succession in the land of the de Poitou kings was almost always determined by gavelkind. Though there were some close calls and some extraordinary measures undertaken to ensure smooth succession, Aquitaine was able to remain whole and achieve empire. Francia's vassals, from highest duke to lowest bishop or mayor, are well pleased with William's rule, and he has led his realm with measure and dignity for over 50 years as a boy and as a man. Though William is far from the wealthiest man in Europe, many are those whose coffers beggar those of Francia. He is by far the most famed, and by some distance the most pious man in the known world. Moreover, Francia is the largest cohesive political entity in Europe as of 1350, with a host that outstrips the admittedly only temporarily beleaguered Golden Horde. The Holy Roman Empire, roughly equal in strength to Francia when whole and well governed, is at present divided, with several wars racking its weary peasants and burghers as kings and dukes contend to see who among them will rule. The Byzantine Empire is in similar straits, with a much weakened Orthodox Church contributing to the rise of heresies, and two wars troubling a normally placid and unperturbable empire. The Golden Horde, for so long an unshakable enemy in the East, is now at war with itself as the jealous High Chief Berk I vies against the boy Kagan Batu to place a prince of his own choosing as lord over the vast Tengri plains. The people of Europe have complete faith in no faith. The Reformed Tengri religion holds sway over 150 holdings east of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Sunni sect, while small, is by far the dominant faith in the Muslim world. The Roman Catholic Church, once an unimpeachable institution, has damaged itself by foolish crusades against the Mongols and holds a much diminished position in 1350. This has allowed heresies, strongest among them the Fraticelli error, to gain root in Iberia, North Africa, and Scandinavia, and the Holy See is powerless to call crusade against these heretic realms, occupied as it is by the heathen Tengri Mongols. Occitan culture has spread from the south of France as far east as the Holy Land, and is making inroads into Italy. France is slowly becoming Occitan, with the previously dominant Frankish culture on its way out. Over mighty Francia, Emperor William I, yet hale but having seen 59 years come and go, stands like a colossus. It is here, in January 1350, that the alternate history of Aquitaine ends, and the alternate history of Francia begins. Can Prince John of Francia, every bit the man his legendary father has become, yet filled with lassitude as his broad potential lies fallow, and he waits for his promised bride to reach womanhood, continue the mighty line of the de Poitou dynasty, and bring Occitan Francia whole into the Renaissance era? Can he and his posterity unite old Aquitaine and Sicily by conquering the lands between them in Italy and Burgundy? If not, it certainly will not be because he was given a dearth of resources to do so with, or a weak heritage to draw from for strength. From here, the Empire of Francia faces new challenges as battle lines begin to be drawn for a struggle of heretofore unimaginable scale for the fate of Europe and the world beyond. Thus begins the alternate history of Francia. Thanks for watching, and I hope you will stay with me through this series. Be glorious.